Okay, good evening, everyone. So this week we're doing Parshat Eikev. It's really hard when we do Parshat Eikev, even though there's some very famous things in it, like the second paragraph of Shema, and that famous pasuk, "What does Hashem ask from us?" But the bulk of the parsha, and this includes the second paragraph of Shema, the bulk of the parsha is very Zionistic. And we're going to be looking at a verse in just a minute that, of course, is extremely Zionistic as well. There are just a lot of verses that talk about, number one, the praises of Eretz Yisrael. We have the 7 fruits are listed in this week's parsha, the mitzvah of benching, which is connected to the produce of Eretz Yisrael. I mean, the rabbis had to derive that you say Birchat HaMazon outside of Eretz Yisrael. And then, of course, we have in the second paragraph of Shema, and in another place in our parsha, it says, how you have to be more careful with your behavior in Eretz Yisrael, that the land is very demanding of a high level of spirituality. And therefore you have to be careful how you behave, because if you don't behave well, then God, God will punish you with, by throwing you out of the land. Okay, so, but there's a lot about Eretz Yisrael, but I chose one pasuk that talks about how wonderful Eretz Yisrael is. And let's take a quick look at the pasuk, and then we'll go a few different places with it. So it's Eretz asher lo b'miskenut tohal bo lechem. It's a land where you eat lechem. Now the translation in front of us, which is the old JPS translation, says food. That lechem is being used, according to this translation, as representative of all food, which we know historically was a common phenomenon. I don't know if your parents were like mine, but my father, Oliver Shalom especially, didn't believe it was a meal if there wasn't bread on the table. Everything was eaten with bread, and that was a very common idea until we discovered carbs at some point. Oh no, we can't eat that. But anyways, now basically, unless we get a falafel once during the week, Rivka and I basically only have bread on Shabbat. But okay, so does it really mean in our verse bread, or as is suggested in this translation, is bread being used as representative of all food? Okay, it can go either way. We'll come back to that. Okay, and lo techsa kol ba, nothing is chaser, nothing is lacking in the land. And then a last phrase at the end that we're going to talk about very, 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 very little. We're going to spend mostly talking about this first part of the pasuk. But at the end of the pasuk, it adds Eretz asher avaneha barzel, a land in which its stones have iron in them. That, in other words, it's possible to mine or get iron out of the rocks of Eretz Yisrael. That's mostly true in the north. It's mostly true in the north. When you go up to Tveria and the Golan and around Tzfat, not in Tzfat, but near Tzfat, Meron, you see there's a lot of black rocks. Stones are black, and that blackness is called barzelit. And it's a basal rock that has a lot of iron in it. So it's true that there are large deposits of rocks that have iron in them in northern Eretz Yisrael. And in whose hills you can mine or cut out copper. It's funny, but this pasuk here in the middle of the land, this is true of Yerushalayim, but also true of Ashkelon. There's very little copper or iron. The iron is way up north, and the copper is way down south, near Eilat. But we have had, Israel really didn't have much in the way of iron mining, even though there is some iron here, but we had a lot of copper mining in the area, in the Negev approaching Eilat. Okay, so that's the pasuk. The things that I really want to talk about in the pasuk, except for a couple of side issues, I really want to talk about that expression, lo b'miskenut, which the translation here says, you may eat without stint. And the Ibn Ezra translation can say scarceness. B'miskenut is a fascinating word. Let's take a quick look at the Ibn Ezra right away, who talks about the word, and then I'm going to tell you what the Targumim, the traditional translations into Aramaic, say. But first, the Ibn Ezra, scarceness, b'miskenut, scarceness, means in poverty and impoverishment. In other words, it's not just that we're not going to be lacking bread, but when we eat bread, it's not going to be in a situation of poverty. We're not going to be below the poverty line, so to speak. And then the Ibn Ezra takes a look at the word and he says it's very much like the word misken. In modern Hebrew, nobody wants to be called a misken. Some people, maybe I should turn off the recording for this. Some people say misken translates like a loser, which is not really true. It means someone who's a little bit pathetic. Miskenim is really the French word les miserables, people who are miserable, people who are in a bad situation. And nobody wants to be called a misken. Even though it's often said in a very sympathetic, kindly way, it's not a good thing to be. A misken is someone who really is in a bad way. But what does it mean in our pasuk? So first, the easiest translation is in the Targum Yonatan, which is usually the less the less literal and more figurative. But I think he nails the literal meaning. He says chusrana, without choser, without lacking. I think that's what seems to be the true pshat. Onkelos says something that's a little bit less pshat. He says, lo atzurin. Atzur means to stop. In other words, without stop. And in other words, that there's always going to be bread growing, crops are always going to be coming. I don't think that's pshat. It's just an interesting approach, but okay. But the translation I'm mostly interested in is Reb Saadia Gaon. Reb Saadia Gaon, who was perhaps the greatest of the rabbis between the 6th and 10th centuries, and he, of course, was the head of the academy in Bavel, and he translates it as lo bitakdir. And he uses a very unusual root, which is kuf dalid resh, kedar. Kedar can mean black, but it usually is used to describe either mourning or depression. And he's saying that the verse is saying something a little bit different than we were saying. We've been saying, oh, there's plenty of bread, or plenty of food if bread is symbolic of all. But he's saying, when you eat your bread, you're not going to feel depressed about it. It's going to be in a more uplifting, positive, perhaps even happy situation. And I don't know what motivated him, because he really didn't comment on this translation. But I think this is a fascinating approach that we will return to a little bit later in the in the class. The Chizkuni, if we go back to the sheet, please, the Chizkuni says, Lo techsabod, you will not lack, you shall not lack for anything. Whatever grows in that land will grow in abundance. That the crops in Eretz Yisrael will grow in abundance. Now, I wish, there was time we could talk about this ad infinitum. It's a wonderful topic. This is only true when Jews live in Eretz Yisrael. We know from the records of the Crusaders and some of the Muslim travelers to Eretz Yisrael in the Middle Ages that the country was really a backwater. I mean, it was really poverty-stricken. In more modern times, Mark Twain came to Eretz Yisrael in 1854, and he wrote about it in a book called Innocents Abroad. If people want to look for the book, it's you can read it free online. There's a lot of websites, including the Gutenberg website, that have it free online. And he talks about how he traveled from the port of Jaffa to Yerushalayim. He was the secretary for the American consul in the old city, and he actually lived right near the Jaffa Gate for a year and a half. And he said on his trip from Jaffa to Yerushalayim, the only living thing he saw along the way was a donkey. It was totally barren. Now, I mean, he basically traveled on the Jaffa Road, which becomes, highway number 1. And besides the fact, it's got a lot of traffic on it, trains and buses and, as well as cars. But you can look around it and there's just abundant gifanim. There's a tremendous number of vineyards around there along the highway, but it's just filled with agricultural stuff. So the interesting thing is, it's true that Eretz Yisrael produces produce in abundance, but only when Jews are here. When we talk about the miracles of the modern state of Israel, that definitely one of them is political military, the victories in 1948 and 49, and of course, a successful government. But one of the great miracles of the state is that we were really in a terrible place, close to starvation in 1950. The population doubled from November 29th, 1947, with the UN declaration, until 1950, our population of Jews went from 600,000 to 1.2 million in just over a year and a half. So we really couldn't feed people. However, by 1956, by the time we had the Suez crisis, Israel was an exporter of food. As we just turned everything around overnight. I mean, in the big picture, how long is 5 years? It's just a remarkable that, yes, Eretz Yisrael produces food in abundance, but only when the Jews are here. If the Jews aren't here, it's a disaster. Okay, so I want to go to the Orach Chaim. And the Orach Chaim, again, a land in which you will not eat bread out of scarceness. He's going to make a suggestion that's quite psychological. We're going to see another one on the back page as well that's very similar, but says it differently. He says, Moses, that's this translation that I stole from the Safari website. Moshe Rabbeinu mentions this as there are people, even wealthy people, who practice the lifestyle of poor people. Now, we know that there are people who are very wealthy, but they live very modestly. Now, why would they do that? They may be motivated out of one of two reasons. One, they're afraid they may lose their wealth and find themselves impoverished. So they're putting away their wealth for a rainy day type thing. Or number two, they do not want to appear wealthy and arouse envy. That if you live in a place where most people are, have very modest means, you don't want to show off. And this is, I think this second this second idea throughout Jewish history was very common, that when Jews were living in Europe, there were a lot of sumptuary laws that the rabbis would say that Jews can't wear certain kinds of clothing or spend certain amounts of money on jewelry or houses or all sorts of things, because we didn't want the Gentiles, we didn't want the Goyim to see what we had and, number one, be jealous, or number two, want to take it away. So this point number two was something that happened very commonly in Jewish history. Okay, Moshe says, where there is no scarcity, to teach the Israelites that both of the reasons mentioned for adopting the lifestyle of the poor, which means eating bread, okay, do not apply in Eretz Yisrael. The two considerations we mentioned were based on the assumption that society is divided into haves and have-nots. This will not be the case in Eretz Yisrael, because no one will lack anything therein. If our wealth would derive from sources outside of the land of Israel, there would be a reason for the considerations we mentioned. Some people would make an effort to get rich, others would not. Seeing the source of wealth is Israel itself, everyone has equal access to it, and there is no need to fear becoming impoverished or to attract the envy of the less fortunate, because everybody has everything they need in Eretz Yisrael. Now, I want to say something about this. In Israel, historically, when I made Aliyah in 1983, it was very common that you went to shul and you didn't know. I lived in a frat, and there were some large houses, but there were like houses like mine that were, more modest, cottagim. And in those days, the prices were relatively sane. The prices today are insane in the frat, especially. But what was interesting was you couldn't tell who, when you went to shul, who was like a big businessman or who was like a college professor and who drove a bus. I mean, everybody dressed, tzanua. People didn't dress up. Once in a while, there were some Americans, they would wear a three-piece suit type thing, and Rabbi Riskin always wore a suit and a tie. But I mean, you really didn't know who was wealthy and who was of modest means. And that was a beautiful thing, I felt, in the community. It's changing. Israel, like many Western democracies, now is having a larger and larger wealth gap. And there is, especially in some suburbs of Tel Aviv, although it happens around Yerushalayim too, but especially in some suburbs of Tel Aviv, there is really tremendous wealth, and there is a lot of ostentation. And it's something that earlier Israeli society didn't have, and I hope we're not getting away from some of our values that we once had. But okay, be it as it may, that's not supposed to be the ideal in Eretz Yisrael. The ideal in Eretz Yisrael is everybody should feel they have enough, and therefore no one, wants to act like they're showing off, because everybody has enough. That's the major point in the Orach Chaim, and I think it's a beautiful point. I wish it were true. I wish it were true in the modern state. I think it once was true, but today I'm thinking less so. Then he makes another point that I'm less interested in, about the end of the verse. Moshe singles out two examples of the earth's natural wealth, which the land of Israel is blessed with, that is iron and copper. The reason Moshe singles out these two examples, because they are basic to everybody's needs. It's interesting, when the time of Moshe Rabbeinu was historically called the Bronze Age, and bronze, of course, was based on copper. The era of David HaMelech was called the Iron Age. So it's interesting that the biblical period was called the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And so that Israel has resources in both of those very important metals that were the basis for civilization. I'm saying for civilization, but we know bronze and iron were mostly used for weapons. That was the technology that produced weapons. So that's the second comment. That I'm less interested. I'm more interested in the psychology of the wealth. Rabbeinu Bechaye. Okay, Rabbeinu Bechaye says again, "On land will you not eat bread in poverty." So what does that mean? A land in which all the good things of earth can be found, such as in the land of Egypt, which the Torah compared to a garden of the Lord. In other words, in our pasuk, Israel is twice compared to Egypt. Nonetheless, lacks certain ingredients found elsewhere, so that people eat bread in such a land of plenty and poverty, not enjoying the affluence around them. In other words, in Egypt, you're going to eat bread with plenty of bread. They have tremendous amount of grain, but you're still going to feel poor. But that's not going to be true in Israel. That's why the Torah praises the Holy Land by comparison to the land of Egypt, saying it offers the same advantages without the accompanying drawbacks. Yes, plenty of bread, but equality of levels of wealth. None of the food products found anywhere in the world are not also available in the land of Israel. I don't know if that's true. We don't grow much rice here, a little bit. We basically don't. We don't, there are a lot of things we don't grow here, but coffee, whatever. Okay, but Rabbeinu Bechaye, writing in the 1300s, thought that was true. Okay. There are, however, agricultural products which were exclusive to the land of Israel. I don't know what he had in mind. I off the top of my head, I don't know of anything that grows in Israel that doesn't grow elsewhere. If anyone can think of something, put it in the chat. Let me know. But I can't. I'm sure Rabbeinu Bechaye had some product in mind, but I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. Okay. But now he makes a totally different idea, which is a drasha. He's leaving the world of pshat, of literal explanation, and he's going into a homiletic idea. And it's a beautiful idea that's going to be expanded upon by a couple of people on the back side of the sheet, which we'll get to in a minute. It is possible that the expression, "you will not eat bread in poverty in that land," refers to something spiritual. That the word lechem, bread, does not refer to physical food. It is a replacement term for something else. This would not be the first time the Torah has been compared to lechem. Okay. Imein kemach ein Torah, so the kemach makes the Torah, which is the bread. Okay, maybe. Compare Proverbs 9:5, where Solomon, quoting the Torah, called wisdom, says, "Come eat my bread." Wisdom says. Chachma says to people, "Come and eat of my wisdom," but I'm calling my wisdom bread. That wisdom, like bread, is the staple, the staff of life, okay? Seeing that it is impossible to acquire Torah and wisdom in the full sense of the word without proper preparation designed to facilitate its study, Moses may indicate here that the ideal such preparation is residence in the land of Israel. In other words, to really be a Torah Jew, you've got to be in Eretz Yisrael, which possesses the physical, please turn the page, the physical conditions such as ideal climate to enable people to study Torah successfully. Scholars studying Torah in that land do not suffer from the handicaps which scholars in other countries suffer from. Now, it's true that when Jews were living in Eretz Yisrael, often the greatest scholars gathered here. But we know that there were periods when the greatest scholars weren't in Israel because of oppression and galut. the great academies of Bavel we talked about before. We mentioned Reb Saadia Gaon. Earlier in the 20th century, the major centers of Torah were in Eastern Europe. Baruch Hashem, today, the great centers of Torah study are here in Eretz Yisrael. And I think I've mentioned this in this class before, or in other classes that I've given for Ashkelon. To me, I can pinpoint when Torah became headquartered in Eretz Yisrael. Until 1986, I think most people would claim that the major centers of Torah were outside of Israel. Until World War II in Europe, after World War II in America. But in 1986, starting in February of 1986, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, the great Rosh Yeshiva of Torah Vodaas, died. In March of 1986, Rav Moshe Feinstein passed away. And in April of 1986, Rabbi Soloveitchik retired because he was just too sick to continue giving classes. So the three great pillars of Torah study that had been in New York were now gone. I mean, there were others that had left before. The Pachad Yitzchak left in the 70s to come to Eretz Yisrael, Reb Hutner, and others had passed away. Of course, Rav Aaron Kotler Zal died in 1962 or 63. But after 1986, it was clear that the great centers of Torah were in Eretz Yisrael, whether we're talking about Yerushalayim or Bnei Brak or other yeshivot that are spread around the country. Now it's clear that this is where Torah emanates from. Okay. I'm in the end of the second line on the second page. Those scholars that have the handicaps of trying to study Torah in Chutz La'aretz belong to the category of people known as eating lechem ha'atzavim, the bread of troubles. Lechem ha'atzavim, which is a quote you can see from Tehillim, from Psalms. In contrast to the people of Israel, the true wealth of the people of Israel, in Israel, is the quality of their Torah knowledge. That is it in terms of this drasha, this homiletic approach of Rabbeinu Bechaye. It's not just bread, meaning, carbohydrates. It also means bread, the staff of life, which is Torah. This is why Moshe underlines this thought by adding, nothing is lacking in the land. You've got bread, you've got Torah, and therefore, since you have Torah, nothing is lacking. And now he makes another point. The blessing is anchored in the word bakol. You have everything. And the Lord had blessed Abraham bakol. So this is a continuation of the brachot given to the patriarchs, that Eretz Yisrael has everything needed for a Torah society, and that was the gift promised to the patriarchs. Okay, I have to keep track of the time a little bit. We're going to take a look at a comment now from the Maharal MiPrague. The Maharal MiPrague, of course, lived in Central Europe, Prague, and he died in 1609. And he didn't usually directly comment on psukim, even though here he does. He mostly was, a philosopher talking about ideas, and quite often you could apply them to psukim. But here he's really talking about our pasuk. So the Maharal says, and that is because the land of Israel does not lack anything in it, and it is a land that is complete in everything. As the verse stated about it, a land where you will lack nothing in it. And this is the thing, as opposed to other lands which are lacking. In other words, when the Jews live in Eretz Yisrael and the land is successful, You've got everything you need here. But if you went to another country, you might find that something is missing. It's a fascinating phenomenon, and I don't know how other people feel about this, but I remember when I first made Aliyah, I really felt like I don't want to say we suffered. That's much too strong a term, but I did feel like we were lacking things. First of all, telephone. We were lacking a telephone, which was made life difficult, and we also felt like there were things that we missed from America. But it's not true today. By time the 90s rolled around, our telephone service, with everybody had cell phones. It was better than the telephone service in America. And most of the products that we missed from the other side of the ocean, had come here. And once in a while you hear someone say, oh, we don't have, in Israel, we don't have pastrami like they have in America, or they don't have X like they have in America. But the truth is there's not that much anymore. And the truth is, when Rivka and I go to America, there were a couple of things that we, that we gorge ourselves on, mostly diet root beer. For some reason, root beer is not appreciated by Israelis. And I don't know why, and we both love it. But okay, but we say, we miss falafel and we miss pita and there are things that we end up saying, we miss this, from Israel. We don't say it on the first day or the second day, but time you get into a month, you start to say, and it used to be like the flip side. Now, it's just interesting. Well, of course, Rivka and I also aren't eating much red meat anymore, so that's something that we might have appreciated in America. So, but we settled for diet root beer, okay, especially A&W. Okay. However, only the land of Israel is complete. Listen where he's going to go with this. I think what he's going to say is a beautiful idea, and I never would have made this connection on my own. And is this thing similar to Israelites? For it is from the angle of their completeness that they have rest and stillness. Okay. And this matter was explained. For anyone who does not have stillness, calmness, tranquility, has not reached completeness. If I don't feel shalom, I can't feel menucha. I can't feel tranquil. And that is why he is in motion. And when I don't feel I've got everything, I'm moving around. I'm jumping around. I'm here and there, and I'm always chasing something. As it has already been explained, if you have learned much Torah, that one in motion is potential, and that one that is completely activated doesn't have to move around. You can settle down, and you can feel this kind of the beautiful Hebrew word for this is the name of one of my wife's granddaughters, shalva. You can feel this, this tranquility, this satisfaction. That one in motion is potential, and that one is completely active, does not have motion. Once you got everything, you don't have to move around anymore. Let's see where it's going to go. As motion is applicable to potential, but what is complete is already activated. Hence, so long as the world was not completed and it was not activated, it did not acquire the stillness of Shabbat, the seventh day, until it was completed. That's what we're saying on Friday night. Only then, vayishbot. It's only then that you can have Shabbat. You can only have Shabbat if you really feel vayechulu, you have completed all of the tasks. It's a fascinating idea. And we're comparing the temporal gift of Shabbat, completeness, everything has been completed and finished and done, to the spatial completeness of Eretz Yisrael. It's got everything, and you can feel that kind of menucha, tranquility in Eretz Yisrael that Shabbat gives us in time. It's a fascinating comparison that I didn't see anyone else who made this kind of connection, but it's very beautiful and it's true. For Shabbat to really work, you've got to feel that there's nothing hanging over me, that there's nothing incomplete. It's not a good Shabbat, and this has happened to everybody, to me too. It's not a fabulous Shabbos if you just know, I have this to do right after Shabbos, I have that to do on Sunday. You've got to make the Shabbat really menucha. You've got to feel, there's nothing hanging over me. Everything has been completed before we lit those candles, before we sang Lecha Dodi. And that's, I think this idea is true. In other words, and we can compare the sense of completeness in time with the sense of completeness in space. And they both should work. Usually I end with someone like Rabbi Nachman, because usually Rabbi Nachman says something very spiritual. It's interesting. He makes a fascinating comment, but it's not, for me, one of those Gavaldic, great ideas. But it's a fascinating idea, and it reflects something about his Weltanschauung. It reflects something about his worldview of Rabbi Nachman. So Likutei Maharan, and he's talking about, and this is its praise, the praise of the land, the Shavach of the land of Eretz Yisrael. Oh, there's a note here. There's nothing like the feeling when the candles have been lit and Shabbos rests on the house. Woo, Shabbos rests on the house. Shabbos rest fills the house. Yes, there's nothing like that. I agree, except maybe am I the only one who sometimes had a Shabbos when there was something going on, coming up either on Saturday night or Sunday, and I just couldn't really have a great Shabbos because I felt like there was something hanging over me. But the regular Shabbos, especially now that that I'm retired, that the Shabbos you really feel, wow, this is it. This is great. And we're supposed to feel that way in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, I know we haven't gotten there, especially, when you live a few miles from Gaza, and the sirens may ring anytime. But this is the ideal of Eretz Yisrael, that we should have that kind of Shabbat. But let's take a look at the Rabbi Nachman. And this is its praise. It is a land where you will not eat your bread in deprivation. Slightly different translation from the others that we had used on the first side, but okay. For sometimes a person eats bread due to poverty. Right, we know that. People that are poor, they fill up on carbs without question, just because they want this sense of feeling full. And not because of a lack of desire for other delectables. They would love to have, something else. They'd love to have a good thick steak, right? But they can't afford it. So they have to settle and fill up with bread, with carbs. On the contrary, if he had other foods, he would not only eat bread. Thus, this is the land of Israel's praise. You will not eat bread due to poverty. This is going to be a slightly different take on an idea that we saw in the Orach Chaim. But he's going to say, but because the desire for eating has been broken and eliminated. Fascinating that Rabbi Nachman is using these psukim to push a bit of an agenda of asceticism, that you really shouldn't want these delectables. You shouldn't want to go to Katsefet or whatever, okay, or whatever place you go to for your excess calories. You shouldn't want to do that. And that Eretz Yisrael should give you the perspective to say, oh, I'm happy because I'm totally satisfied with what I have. I don't need those those delectables, or I don't need that gold. I don't need it. And because it's not that I do have everything, it's that I don't feel I need anything beyond the things that I have. It's an interesting approach. But because the Desifian has been broken and eliminated, I wish I could say that was true. I mean, I can't eat chopped liver, but when I see chopped liver on the table, it definitely entices me. Okay. For the land of Israel receives an illumination and an influx of bounty from the aspect of tefillin, that, everything's in your head, right? Tefillin, that it's controlling me, my actions and my thoughts. It's the aspect of Yaakov, who is truth and is control, right? From which wealth stems. True wealth isn't having these things. True wealth, Ezehu Asher, who is the truly wealthy person? Hasamech bechalko. It's from the sense, the feeling of satisfaction, of I have everything I need. From which wealth stems. Thus, it is that his eating only bread. Now he's changing the verse. The verse did not say that you're only eating bread. And we remember, we already saw in who was it? Was it the Chizkuni? Oh no, it's the Or Chaim, that bread meant all food. So he's totally disagreeing with the Or Chaim on the other side. Thus it is that his eating only bread, which is not what the pasuk says, has nothing to do with poverty, but with the breaking of the desire for eating. Interesting approach. And it's not the normative approach of Hasidut. Hasidut said there's nothing wrong with, al-chaim and enjoying physical things, taking physical things and raising them to spiritual pleasures. It's a fascinating thing that Rabbi Nachman, unlike most of the Hasidic Rebbeim in the beginning of the 19th century, was an ascetic. He believed in denying oneself a lot of worldly pleasures. Just a fascinating approach that he learns from this pasuk, which most commentaries are saying means, you really do enjoy this world. Okay? A little bit different than everybody else. We're going to end with the Akedat Yitzchak. The Akedat Yitzchak was Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, and he lived in the 16th century. And he's much more of a philosopher. And he's actually not commenting directly on our pasuk. He's commenting on a statement, a ma'amar in Pirkei Avot. And it's a famous statement in Pirkei Avot, and it says, he who tries to divest himself of the yoke of Torah has the yoke of government and bureaucracy imposed upon him. In other words, we're supposed to welcome all of the Torah and its mitzvot. We're supposed to welcome all of the obligations which Torah puts upon me. Because the truth of the matter is, you think that accepting other ways of life is going to be less onerous? No, you're wrong. If you ever gave up on Torah, you become, if I can use the expression, enslaved to other things. Torah frees us from other things by putting my kishkas, by putting my energy into Torah. It ends up freeing me from much more onerous other responsibilities that would come my way. The specific one mentioned in Pirkei Avot is the government. Remember, Pirkei Avot was written by Tanaim, who felt very much oppressed by the ruling power of Rome in Eretz Yisrael. But okay, it could be, some of us, he who tries divestment of the yoke of Torah may have the yoke of business. the yoke of competition. Now that's everybody has a yoke that is somehow either controlling them or burdening them. But what we're saying in this statement in Pirkei Avot, that the best yoke you can possibly have, the only yoke that leads to true fulfillment, is this yoke, this connection to Torah. Okay. That's the Mishnah, and he's going to bring it back to our pasuk. If one encounters certain difficulties in life, one often does not have to search very far for the reasons. I think that's reasonable. If I'm having a problem, I can quite often, find the source of that problem, the thing that caused me to be in this bad situation, whether it's something to have to do with my work or a person got me into trouble. But usually, or quite often, I can find the source of my difficulties. It's usually due to an imbalance in the way one has handled one's priorities. In other words, I got into this trouble because I really was putting too much energy into this project as opposed to better, more important, more fulfilling things. Okay. So what I'm supposed to do, according to the Akedat Yitzchak Arama, I must always be setting my priorities. Interesting where he's going to go with this. What should some of these priorities be? Torah study, mitzvah performance, have to be given equal time with the pursuit of one's economic goals. If I am going to be a successful Torah Jew, I should be able to find a satisfactory balance between parnasa, taking care of my physical and financial needs, with Torah, taking care of my spiritual sanctity needs. I'm always supposed to be balancing them. I think this is very important, and that these kinds of Torahs from the late Middle Ages should be taught more forcefully in a society that seems to sadly, denigrate, earning a living. We're supposed to be balancing these obligations. There should be a balance. Okay. Torah study, mitzvah performance have to be given equal time with the pursuit of one's economic goals. Equal time. Okay. Nourishment of the soul is not provided by the same source as nourishment for the body. So our pasuk is saying Eretz Yisrael helps out with certain kinds of nourishment, but there are going to be other kinds of nourishment too. And then he says, a healthy body is needed to enable the souls to function at full capacity. If I don't take care of my physical body, my soul is not going to be able to function. I'm not going to be able to go to shul. I'm not going to be able to perform mitzvot. I'm not going to be able to live a full life. And that means both day by day and, how many decades I can survive. It's very important that we find this balance in life. For that reason, all reasonable effort must be made to attain sustenance. In the Torah, we are told, man does not live by bread alone, but by everything which emanates from the mouth of God does man live. Onkelos renders that statement, man does not live by bread alone, as follows: you shall observe my statutes and my social laws, so that man ensures eternal life for himself when he carries them out. The expression to live thereby, accordingly, refers to sustenance for our spiritual half. Tov Torah im derech Eretz. Im ein kemach, ein Torah. Torah is only good if it also has a way of supporting yourself financially. That there has to be, before you can have Torah, you have to have kemach, you have to have carbs, okay? You have to have food on the table. So this is where the Akedah Yitzchak is going with our pasuk, as you'll see. The expression to live thereby accordingly refers to sustenance for our spiritual half. All the commandments that become applicable upon entry into the Holy Land give sustenance to the spiritual part of the Jew. The land is therefore described as one in which you do not eat bread out of scarceness. It is a land that does not demand so much physical labor that its inhabitants cannot find enough time to devote themselves to their spiritual tasks. According to the Akedah Yitzchak, go back to the pasuk at the beginning of the page, at the top of the front page for just 1 second. Okay, I know we're running out of time, but just look at the pasuk again. And we're going to look at it in the light of the words of the Akedah Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama. Okay, Eretz asher lo b'miskenut tochel bo, a land in which you eat bread not in a difficult or poverty-stricken or scarce way. Okay, lo techsa kol ba. The land doesn't lack anything. I can easily make enough money to support myself so that I don't have to lack anything. The anything, he's not saying what the drasha of Rabbeinu Bechaya said in the front part, on the front page, that the bread is a metaphor for Torah. No, he's saying the bread is bread. And therefore, I have to have the bread, the real bread, and then I can have the other things that without bread, I would be chaser, I would be lacking. Eretz Yisrael is supposed to be the kind of country where you are able to earn your living and still have enough time and energy left to take care of your spiritual needs, which include Torah study, minyanim, davening, mitzvah performance, all sorts of good spiritual pursuits. That's what the pasuk. And so look at the pasuk again. It's looking at a balance. Eretz asher lo b'miskenut ba'lechem. It's a land where there's no shortage of consuming bread. Lo techsa kol ba. Nothing is lacking in it. I therefore am able to take care of my spiritual needs. That may not happen in another country. Eretz Yisrael is the place where we're supposed to find that most healthy of balances between taking care of my physical needs and taking care of my spiritual needs. That I don't think is a drasha on the pasuk. I think after reading the Akedah Yitzchak, I think that's the pshat in the pasuk, that we're supposed to find that balance. And Eretz Yisrael is the best place for finding that balance. And I just hope that the continued development economically and agriculturally of Eretz Yisrael will continue to be a source for this kind of lifestyle. And then we just have to hope that the Jews living here will truly try to find that kind of balanced life, physical needs and spiritual needs, and find the way of making sure that here in Eretz Yisrael, we can indeed fulfill both of them and have a truly full, complete, and shalva, satisfied life. Okay, so I want to thank people for coming this evening. But you can tell I already got a couple excuses from people they couldn't make. Please let them know that I hope before the end of tomorrow, I'll have the recording up. And it was just nice to see everybody. And
thank you very much, Rabbi.
Have a wonderful week, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, Erev Tov.